Welcome to what is honestly a deeply troubling investigation. In this explainer, we're diving into one of the worst, yet somehow largely unacknowledged corporate betrayals in American history. It's a really dark, cinematic story about a town that put its complete trust in an industrial giant and the horrifying, totally invisible price that was paid in blood, breath, and ultimately the ground right beneath their feet. Before groundwater plumes, there were bodies. Long before environmental agencies ever even thought to start mapping toxic groundwater or tracking chemical migration, the true cost of this disaster was already being paid by the workers themselves. These were just everyday people, right? People who simply wanted to earn an honest living, to provide for their families. But instead, they became the tragic, totally unrecorded victims of an industrial nightmare that would eventually just swallow the whole town. So
Okay, let's dive into this. We all recognize that trusted stamp of wherever, right? Branded as America's favorite cookware. They were basically selling the ultimate post-war American dream. Those lightweight, rust-proof aluminum pans you'd find in literally every kitchen across the country. But there is a deeply dark, incredibly gritty reality to how these pans were actually manufactured. And it is a reality completely stripped of that wholesome, trusted branding.
To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this operation, step inside the Chillicothe plant with me back in 1958. Owned by ALCOA, this facility was an absolute economic anchor for the town. It provided jobs, routine, stability, the whole shebang. But secretly, behind those brick walls, in order to mass produce all that cookware, the company was actively subjecting its own workforce to unimaginably dangerous, totally unregulated conditions. Which brings us to a really devastating reality. The workers themselves were basically the unacknowledged monitoring wells. Men like Guy McQuaid, who walked into the plant fresh out of the National Guard, unknowingly became the factory's very first filtration system. Their lungs absorbed the dangerous solvents. Their kidneys literally filtered the toxic degreasers right out of their blood. And even worse, they brought these chemicals home on their work clothes, where their wives unknowingly laundered that exposure straight into their baby's clothes. It's just heartbreaking. And the undeniable proof of these conditions comes directly from the people who actually survived them. Former worker Steve Specht explicitly recalls these huge, open benzene tanks and washing tunnels that were just completely full of the chemical. Why? Just to clean oil off the pans. And here's the thing, benzene isn't just some industrial soap. It is a known potent carcinogen that seeps right into human bone marrow. And these workers were exposed to it every single day, with some guys even dipping the pans by hand straight into the liquid. No gloves, nothing. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute sheer madness of the factory floor, which was essentially a completely unregulated chemical cocktail. We're talking sweet-smelling, cancer-causing benzene. Workers were sweeping up what they thought was just harmless grit, right? Turns out it was lead-laced walnut shell dust. They saw heavy, constant use of trichloroethylene, or TCE, as a degreaser. Then there's the cadmium-loaded wastewater from the porcelain processing, and entirely unregulated fluoropolymer coatings. They handled severe neurotoxins and carcinogens day in and day out without any real warning or protection whatsoever. Now, you might naturally be wondering, was this just some accidental oversight of the era? Well, it turns out the company's own 1981 EPA notification form plainly states that their hazardous waste handling dated all the way from 1948 to 1981. Literally the entire time the plant was open. So no, this toxic waste stream wasn't an accident. It was a calculated industrial doctrine built right into the workflow from the very first day of production. And when you look at the sheer physical scale of this contamination, it's just staggering. 25. That is how many designated toxic source zones the remedial investigation eventually identified across the property. Let that sink in. 25. These weren't just accidental spills or leaks. These were distinct, designated disposal zones where the ground itself was deliberately turned into a massive, buried chemical graveyard. And the actual concentration of these chemicals, it's terrifying. When monitoring finally occurred, TCE levels in the groundwater were found at an absolutely staggering 5,300% above the EPA limit. 5,300%. And remember, TCE isn't just a harsh cleaner. It's a severe central nervous system depressant and a brutal carcinogen that completely ravages the liver and kidneys. That is a hard-hitting, undeniably catastrophic level of contamination sitting directly beneath the community, well past the point of any safe threshold. Which brings this whole historical horror right into the present day. Because by 2022, readings for the wells closest to Mary Lou Patton Park mapped out a toxic plume of TCE and vinyl chloride that is highly active beneath the city today. This legacy isn't gone, guys. You have massive numbers. We're talking 1,120% above the legal limit, lurking right near public spaces where families gather and kids play.
So what does this all mean for the company? How did the polluters react when the law finally caught up with them? Well, this brings us to what we can call the accountability era. On one hand, in the late 70s and 1980, strict environmental laws like RCRA and the Superfund Act were finally passed, making companies retroactively responsible for their toxic messes. And in direct response to that, corporate ownership of the plant suddenly began to rapidly fracture and shift. It basically turned into a high-stakes, multi-million-dollar game of hot potato. When you track this corporate shell game chronologically, a pretty wild pattern emerges. ALCOA opens the facility back in 1948. Then, in 1982, right as those strict new environmental laws take effect, they suddenly transfer ownership to Wherever Realty and Westray. When the EPA finally issues formal director's orders in 1993, the property magically transfers back to ALCOA in 1994, now essentially a contaminated shell. Finally, in 1999, a monitoring agreement is established. It's pretty clear. Just as regulators started knocking on the door, the baton of liability was passed around to protect the bottom line.
And the really crucial point here is that this behavior wasn't just a one-off. The corporate descendants tied to this facility, Alcoa, Newell, Howmet, they have a deeply documented pattern of this stuff. I mean, the feds forced massive PCB cleanups on them at the St. Lawrence River. Millions in penalties were paid for Ohio River pollution over in Indiana. They were actually caught hoarding PCB-contaminated soil at Newell Recycling. And then Howmet was fined for literally classifying hazardous waste as a product to avoid dealing with it. It is a clear, documented history of doing just enough to get caught and then doing just exactly enough to settle.
Which naturally leads us to the so-called cleanup at Chillicothe. To be blunt, the 1999 remedy was really just a gamble disguised as a cleanup. The Ohio EPA honestly failed the community here. Instead of demanding a full, rigorous excavation and actual removal of the toxic soil, they just accepted a containment strategy. It was a deal that perfectly managed financial risk for the corporate balance sheets, rather than demanding a real, permanent restoration for the public's health. But here's the catch. That containment strategy relied on a very, very fragile set of circumstances, which really ramps up the urgency here and forces us to ask an absolutely critical question. What happens when the only thing holding back a massive toxic plume just shuts down? This completely pivots our explainer from a tragic story of the past to a terrifying active present-day crisis. You see, for decades, there was a nearby paper mill, the Pixel Paper Mill, and its massive collector wells were pulling millions of gallons of groundwater a day, unknowingly acting as this huge hydraulic barrier that kept the Wherever carcinogens basically frozen in check. This wasn't an intentional safety measure, guys. It was pure, fragile luck holding a total disaster at bay. But now, that mill has closed for good, and the EPA itself has literally called this closure a worst-case scenario. Because without that mill pumping water, the reality becomes an absolute ticking time bomb for the city today. That hydraulic containment, it is entirely eliminated. That underground toxic plume of carcinogens is now completely free to migrate wherever it wants, and the groundwater there flows southeast, directly toward homes, farms, and local businesses. In fact, a recent city report explicitly noted that Chillicothe's drinking water is highly susceptible to contamination. The chemicals are no longer frozen in place, the leash is officially off, and the entire town is at serious risk.
So we finally arrive at the haunting reality of this entire saga. Like the quote says, the factory weighed its millions and the workers paid with everything they had left. This is the dark, heavy inheritance left to the Chillicothe community, a loyal workforce completely betrayed, a town polluted, and a crisis that is still actively unfolding right beneath their feet as we speak. It really leaves you to wonder, if a disaster of this magnitude could happen and be covered up in plain sight for so long, how many other towns out there are sitting on a toxic legacy exactly like this one, just waiting for the water to shift?